This lecture is going to focus upon the Gambrill text in chapters 8, 9, and 10. And in this section, she includes these chapters in her topic of a decision-focused practice model. This fits very well with the chapters out of the other textbooks that we're looking at this week, and is using different words and a somewhat different perspective. Once again, covering much the same process in the early phases of our work with clients. Now, she says frequently throughout the textbooks that how it is that we frame our problems, how we see our problem, really kind of sets the pace and determines where we're going to go with our clients, what we're going to do with them. She mentions that I think at earlier lecture we talked about her question about whether are we problem solvers or problem setters, are we involved in problem solving or problem setting, and a lot of how we look at our client situation determines the kind of problem that we identify with our client to work on. So the first basic question she talks about is, what kind of problem is it? Does it have to do with lack of resources? Is it a lack of skills on the part of the client? Are there emotional problems, legal problems? And again, that's just kind of a starting point for defining the problem, as it will be much deeper. There isn't a simple answer to most all of these questions for our clients. Then we have to ask ourselves what kind of theory we're going to draw upon. Is it we going to, for instance, psychoanalytic systems theory, behavioral interventions, those kinds of ideas and questions in terms of starting out. What kind of model are we going to use in servicing our client? What do we explore to determine the kind of problem it is? Where do we go? Do we look at the client's psychological issues and psychological traits? Are we willing to look at the environment? Are we going to consider the service systems and how they contribute to the problems? What about public policies and practices of our agency and that type of thing? What kind of assessments or data are we going to use throughout our work, self-reports, testing, specific tests and things like that? Are we going to refer to our own observations and rely upon that as much as possible? And the observation is going to be in session? Are they going to be in the home or in the field somewhere? Lots of different questions to answer as we begin to look at how we're going to work to help our clients. How do we evaluate claims? So we use that is claims of effectiveness. We're just going to use our common sense or our practice theory and the benefits of the experts around us, so to speak, or do we rely more upon scientific criteria? Now she's going to encourage us to look at scientific criteria as much as possible, although she does acknowledge in her book that sometimes our ability to do that is limited, and we have to look at other ways to evaluate the claims of effectiveness as well. You see the other questions here. One of the big questions: what do you do if we don't have the resources we need? I mean, what if you do the research into different kinds of approaches, looking for good studies to indicate the effectiveness of an intervention you want to use, and you really don't find any interventions as useful. What do you do there? I mean, do you provide interventions that are untested? In many cases, that's going to be the answer that you're going to find you and your colleagues are using. Or do you do nothing? Do you just tell your client there really isn't anything you can do to help and offer some support in living with the circumstances of that client's life? I think that's probably not the best option, from a realistic standpoint. Sometimes we have to refer to other agencies or refer to self-help groups and things like that. If the problem we're looking for, if we can't find a good way to deal with that, perhaps we can break that problem down and look at more smaller parts of it and work on those smaller parts instead. There's a number of different ways to look at this, so don't give up if you can't find the resources from the beginning. What level of the client's life, so to speak, are we going to intervene on? Is it going to be individual work or family work? Do we look to work with the community or engage the community in the work as well? Do we have to advocate for change in agency policy or social policy? Do we help to organize our client to challenge certain injustices in society? Lots of different questions to answer there as well. Some of the ways those are answered is going to depend upon where you're working, what your role is in the agency, because there are restrictions oftentimes in what you can do depending upon where you're working. And to look at different ways to evaluate our progress during the process, and then also try to find ways for the client to be able to generalize what is learned or gained in treatment to life after treatment, and in order to maintain that over a period of time. So these are different kinds of things, decisions that you're going to make in the process of of providing intervention for clients. Now, as I've mentioned already, problem definition is critical, and one of the things that we do know is, both in terms of offering treatment services as well as finding the most effective way to do that, is there's an awful lot of uncertainty out there, and we have to be able to live with that uncertainty and try to find ways to be as effective as possible in providing our services. We should always remember not to ignore what's going on in the environment around the client also, because this has a lot to do with not only probably contributing to the issues that brought the client to you, but is also going to be instrumental in supporting or undermining the efforts that you have with your client in treatment. And now, while you may have to have domain specific knowledge in providing services, sometimes again, because of the setting where you're working or the community in which you're employed, you may have limited domain specific knowledge about that, and there's a number of different options that you can provide, or that you can consider when that comes up, including getting good effective supervision and providing the services that you more or less have to provide because of the limitations of your agency. Gambrill criticizes social workers, saying that oftentimes we satisfice rather than optimize. And by satisficing, what she means is that sometimes we arrive at a solution that's acceptable, but probably not optimal. So this is just something that I think, I find that her text is critical of the field, because of the fact that we oftentimes settle for less than the best, and this is going to come out a couple of times in this particular set of slides as well. And again, keep in mind what I tell you in our lectures as well, that while as much as I appreciate the points that she makes when she is critical of the field and of the profession, by the same token, you're going to practice in a realistic setting in the real world out there, and optimizing is just not always possible. Now, that doesn't mean you give up and you don't try to improve services, or do the best you can, or ask your agency to do the best it can in providing services. But there are times when you have to recognize that there is going to be only so much you're going to be able to do, and she'll tell you this later on in this lecture as well, that to expect perfection from yourself is just the fast track to burnout. So keep this in mind, and I'm not saying take it with a grain of salt, but understand that sometimes satisficing is what you're left to do, and that's the sad fact, because of funding and staffing issues and those kinds of things. Now, our goals direct our actions as well, and so while we're going to develop goals for this treatment contract with the client as well, what we hope to see the client achieve in the process of our work is something that's going to have a big impact upon where we go in setting goals with our clients. And it's very easy for us to decide on options too soon, to jump to conclusions, and to not look at alternatives for interventions, perhaps because we're particularly comfortable with a particular type of intervention, or it's the most time efficient, or whatever it might be. But we should try our best not to fall into what she calls these intelligence traps while we're kind of making our plans and setting our goals in motion. So corrective feedback is one of those things that has to do with making mistakes, I think, and so we need to look at that, if there are setbacks in what we do, as an opportunity for us to learn from our experience. She says it's not enough that we have experience, but what's more important is that we allow ourselves to learn from our successes and from our mistakes as well. How we allocate our own resources influences success. And I take that to mean, among other things, where we put our attention and how much time can we and do we allow ourselves for maybe research and and getting in there and looking for best practice alternatives. Um, how much time do we allow for reflecting upon what we've done with our client and evaluating our progress? How much time do we allow for self-care as well? Do we make sure that when we leave work at the end of the day that we're taking care of ourselves so that when we can come in the next morning we're recharged and ready to go? It does no one any good to drive ourselves into the ground and burn ourselves out trying to provide the best services we can. So she says both problem related knowledge, that domain specific knowledge we was talking about, as well as self knowledge, influences our success. What do we know about ourselves, our limits, our areas of expertise, our values, our capacities? Those kinds of things are very important for us to also reflect upon in our work. She says that successful problem solvers think more about their thinking and critically review their assumptions and reasoning all of the time. That's a lot of work to do that, to be reflecting on the things that you accept and to question those things. But she believes that the best problem solvers are those who are willing to do that and who take the time to do that. So deciding how we're going to structure the problem is this critical step early in problem solving, early in the problem solving phase. She encourages us to be very specific, that vague descriptions of problems get in the way of identifying the behaviors and circumstances in which they occur and the things that we want to change. And so try to be as specific as possible in describing the problem, in framing the problem, so that we know exactly what it is we're targeting and what we want to change and how we want to see it change. She uses a very good example of how the different kinds of theories that we might make or use rather in framing a problem really kind of represents a whole different way of approaching the issues. And she uses the example of homelessness as one example. If we see the problem as the client's fault, then essentially we're subscribing to the idea this person is lazy or that this person is engaging behaviors that contribute to that problem. And so in order to resolve the issue of homelessness, we're going to work on the client's alcoholism and try to get them trained in a job and prepared to interview for a position so he can go to work, perhaps. Very, very focused on the individual. And then there are other ways that you can look at this, in the different levels of intervention, on the family level, the community level. You can see that on the community level, the issue may be the lack of affordable housing for people who don't have a lot of income. And so while you may still be working with the individual on other related individual issues, you may also be intervening on the community level to try to engage the community leaders in developing more affordable housing. Now, that's the kind of work that takes you oftentimes after hours, and so we all want to be an advocate for our clients, but we also have to be realistic and fair to ourselves in what we expect of ourselves in order to address problems. But this is an example of, if you're at an agency where they look at, community organization, that's the level that you're going to engage, during your work time. You're going to engage, community leaders in looking at the problem that way. You can see other ways of framing the problem and how the difference in how that problem is framed really has a different result in terms of where you're going to target your efforts, what you're going to focus upon in trying to resolve the issue. And of course, in almost all these situations, as this list suggests at the very end, is that there's often a mix of some or all of these different levels of problems. And so again, we have to target where we're going to work and what efforts we're going to focus upon, and that helps us to determine the interventions we're going to use. She says that novices in the field tend to accept problems as they're presented, so that I think basically this would say in the case of the homeless person, we'd be looking at changing the individual, but that experts tend to structure the problems on a more abstract level and look at it from a larger perspective, and see how it is that the economic system contributes to the problem, and may want to address issues on a larger level as well. You remember, if from the Kornoyer text, he talked about, I believe, the five P's. That was psych, prep, perspire, persevere, and persist. I think here you see the same thing, but in different languages, identifying, clarifying the problem, and preparing for, you know, uh, what we're going to do. And a big question here that she mentions is what has been tried before, and that's a good thing to find out when you're taking a history with a client is, what have what has been done about this problem before? What kinds of things have you tried to do or have others tried to do to resolve this issue? Because that tells you a little bit about maybe where your efforts are going to be best directed this time around. It doesn't mean that you wouldn't try the same thing again, but perhaps not. Depends on what exactly explained the persistence of the problem after previous attempts to change it. You begin to look for solutions that are feasible and are going to result in the desired outcome. Of course, you want to make sure that the work that you do, is focused upon, is going to be directed towards achieving the outcome. And it's surprisingly easy to get off track if you're not careful. Develop your plan of intervention that's likely to be successful. And again, I think this goes back to finding something early on where that the client can achieve, so that the client can begin to experience some success. It will really help that person to engage more in the process with you. Put the plans into action, evaluate the results, and if the results were not successful, what do we do? Do we try again if it didn't work the first time? Or is there a more effective way to implement the plan? Or should the assessment itself be revisited and come up with a new idea, a new problem to focus upon, or a new way to frame this particular problem? Could another plan be more successful? Were there barriers that maybe could be removed? And those are all things that you want to ask yourself as you're going along. Remember, your other thinkers tell you that progress is not a steady slope ever going upwards, but it is a spiral of change that goes up and down and up and down as time goes on. And so you're always looking for barriers and ways to overcome things that may be stepping in the way of progress. When we're trying to frame the problem, when we're trying to identify what needs to be changed and how best to do that, one of the things we should be aware of is the fact that bias is really enters this picture on all levels, not only our own bias, but also the bias of the other persons that have been involved in maybe the information gathering about the problem, in describing the problem for you, for that matter. So that a lot of times when we're trying to figure out what resources to use and what approach to use, we rely upon the things that's available to us, and that may be the things we're most familiar with as well. So just understand that we're biased towards these methods and to these resources that are readily available to us, that guide our choices, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're the best choices. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that because we're familiar with it and we have them at hand, doesn't mean it's the best thing to do. She introduces the topic, I believe it's been introduced earlier, about the fundamental attribution error in our thinking about our clients. That is, that we tend to attribute the cause of other people's behaviors to the characteristics of those persons rather than to the situation in which those clients exist, or which those persons exist. So basically, we blame the individual for their situation, and that's known as the fundamental attribution error. Oftentimes, most often, I believe, when you look at the bigger picture and you assess it on the multiple levels that we interact with in our lives, we find that there are many other levels of issues that relate to that problem, and that it isn't just a matter of changing the individual, of fixing the individual. Well, I think I already mentioned about preconceptions and preferred theories, that we tend to tend to rely upon the things that we we're familiar with, I think. And by the way, she mentions in here the stereotypes are one kind of preconception. This idea that we know some things about an individual because of their involvement in a particular group, whether it be a racial group or a gender or sexual orientation or whatever. That sometimes we enter into our interactions with those people as with preconceptions of things because we of things we believe about that particular group, and we tend to recognize it within our own groups that there's a lot of variability, but for individuals who belong to what we call our out groups, that is the groups that we're not involved in, we tend to see them. We see less variability in out groups than we do in our in groups, and so keep that in mind, and we want to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to stereotype people to come to us, and we know that intellectually. I mean, we all know that, and I don't think any of you would knowingly stereotype and act on those stereotypes, but it's sort of that gut level kind of response to other people, I think, that we have to watch out, and I think we all do on a certain level approach other people with certain stereotypes in mind. There are those who say it's the only way we can deal with the world. There are every individual, when you think about all the individuals out there in the world, and millions of people, and how many, probably dozens, if not hundreds of people you interact with every day. If you had to always relate to each individual, and for that matter, each situation that you enter into as a unique individual, a unique situation, you wouldn't be able to function because of all the different variabilities and everything. There's no way you could really function. And so, as a way of dealing with this complex world we live in, we tend to group people, group situations, and so on into categories, and that kind of allows us to proceed to deal with the individual aspects that we perceive of the situation individual without being driven crazy by all the variabilities. Yet, you understand what I'm saying? We have to group in order to be able to deal with the world. We just have to be careful as workers that the grouping that we do as we approach our clients aren't ones that first of all, close us off to the reality of the client's existence, but also that doesn't cause us to do things that will harm that client. I think it's an interesting kind of thing, that the stereotyping is a, is a negative certainly, but it's also something that enables us to kind of function on a day-to-day basis. Case examples, vividness and concreteness in case examples. And one of her favorite targets in the book are parent education classes. She doesn't like them, obviously. And because I think she said, we overuse them. And frankly, my experience in, with OCS was sort of one of those standard kind of interventions that workers almost always use, was that parents are one of the first things parents are going to be asked to do would be to go to a parent education course, and clearly from a supervisory standpoint, I could see there were some people who really, sending somebody to a parent education class was like going to grad school for somebody who'd only gotten through the fifth grade, and there are a lot of other basic things that needed to be done before they would be able to engage in parent education in a way that they could absorb it and understand it and benefit from it. And so why do parent education classes, maybe why are they less effective than they might be? I think because we throw everybody into parent ed courses, and a lot of people just don't belong there yet. They really don't. And I had a hard time convincing workers of that because it's one of those go-to things they use. So anyway, Gambrill's very critical of parent education, the use of parent education classes, and she'll tell you that the studies indicate very clearly that they're not effective, at least not to the degree that we want to believe it. And yet, when we're talking about concreteness and case examples, I can tell you some clients, parent education classes that I taught, that I led, were more effective, of course, and I can tell you one or two people that really were changed, and why they were changed and how that happened. And so, when I think about referring somebody to parent ed, I might remember those people and think, this really helped Mrs. Smith, and I think this is a person that could be helped as well. And so that's what she's talking about here, that we always remember those anecdotes of those situations, and sometimes we'll use them even though the statistics, that situation flies in the face of the good sense that the statistics give us about such an intervention. So it's just, again, it's just kind of the way we think, and in a way, that's kind of how we negotiate and how we deal with all the many things we have to deal with in this profession, and we just need to be aware of these things. Um, Recency, generating theories early. My goodness, you'll see this when you're out in the field practicing, and one of your colleagues goes off to a conference on one thing or another and returns, and they're born again. And everything, it seems like half the clients that they see, get passed through this filter of all this information they just had in this most recent training session, and they see all their clients very differently now because of that, and they want you to see your clients differently because of that information that they got, and that's recency. What we last see or hear sometimes has an awful lot of influence on the choices that we make and the filters that we use in perceiving our clients' situations. Resemblances between theories is another thing, and also confirmatory bias. In interviewing, you want to interview a child in a forensic interview about possible sexual abuse allegations, and well, because perhaps you know the family, you know this child, and you're pretty sure you know what happened, you still have to have that child tell you in the child's own way for it to be something that could be useful to you in proceeding legally speaking to protect the child. And so you go into that interview, that forensic interview with the child, with a bias that says, I know this is what happened. And that bias will impact your ability to interview that child correctly. And really could interfere in helping to build the case that you want to build to protect that child. Um, Confirmatory bias is these things where we overweigh evidence that supports our beliefs and we ignore and underweigh evidence that contradicts our beliefs. And so these self-fulfilling prophecies, these things we want to see be the truth, come out of that. So these are all things, again, in problem framing and in evaluating our progress and all these kinds of things. These are things we want to watch out for. When we grow up, I don't know, most of us, at least I think it's true, not probably on purpose, but inadvertently we're taught to hide our mistakes. We want to be right, we want to succeed, and so we have a lot of problems revealing mistakes that we've made in our lives, and I think this is a generalization, and it may be not true for everybody, but it is for most of us, I think. So when we hide our mistakes, then of course that makes it very difficult for us to correct them later. And Gambrill says, we have to approach these things being willing to say, I don't know, and be willing to say from time to time, I was wrong about this. And in doing that, it really frees us up to learn from those mistakes so that they're less likely to be repeated in the future. I mean, mistakes are inevitable. And even under the best of circumstances, as she said, with all the uncertainty we have in identifying the client's problems and in understanding another person and the way they see the world, and being able to approach that person's life in a way that we can help shape it more positively for him or her. Um, Failure is something that's almost inevitable at one time or another, that those things are going to occur. And so we have to be ready not to be perfect, because if we think we have to be perfect, then we won't stay in the field for very long, and that's the demoralizing that she talks about. We don't always succeed, and we don't want to punish ourselves for making human mistakes in the process of trying to help others. As she says, our ignorance is vast. So she introduces us in this unit to evidence-based practice, and evidence-based practice, heretofore referred to as EBP, uh, is a decision-making approach to practice and policy that is designed to handle uncertainties in an informed and honest manner within the context of a supportive helping relationship drawing on practice theory. That's a big sentence and a lot of information there to absorb. But that's in essence, that's a good definition of EBP. It involves the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence. Evidence. That's current best practice evidence in making decisions about the care of individual clients. And let me just fix this right away here, right in front of you. See, I make a mistake. Anyway, EBP really requires us to try to integrate as much as possible the best research evidence out there with our clinical expertise and with our clients' unique values and circumstances. Now, the clinical expertise is one of those things. You'll have. I know in child protection, where I've spent the last couple decades of my work. I mean that's such a big problem, and nobody really knows how to resolve the issue. I mean, truth be told, not in a larger sense at least. So one of the things that we tend to do when we have to deal with very difficult cases and is to cling to models and administration will and for those of you that may be practicing in OCS now, please integrate this, but don't take this and challenge your supervision in my name, because this is my perspective only. But oftentimes the agency will rely upon models that they want their workers to use, and what that does is, in a sense, is sort of immunizes the agency, because you have this model that they believe is effective. And to be honest with you, at one point I don't know if they're still using it or not, but they were using a model that actually bragged that they had never done any scientific studies to see if their approach was effective. And he said they didn't need to do that because they could just tell that their approach made sense. And boy, I'll tell you, I can believe that. But anyway, this is a model we were being given to use, and it sort of immunizes the administration, because they give us this model that's supposedly been tested by the experts, and so when things go wrong, it's not the agency's fault, because they've given the workers a model to use. And so I just say that because I had this argument a number of times, that the model's a good thing, but in the end, we hire people with degrees to make decisions about the safety of children, and we can't always just follow what the model says, going from A to B to C to D, therefore E and F will happen. The worker's individual expertise has to come into play there, and not saying get rid of the model or not to pay attention to the model, but there are points of human judgment that have to be made in the process, and not just child protection but all of our work. So clinical evidence can inform practice, can give you an idea what the experts say is what should be done, but clinical evidence can never replace individual clinical expertise, because one of the things this expertise is decides how the evidence, how the model, whatever you want to call it, applies to the individual client, and how it does not apply, and how the situation fits or doesn't fit into that evidence or that model. And so in the end, it's still the worker, and the worker's expertise is something that's very critical in this process. And so don't take ABP and the notion of looking for good, solid scientific testing to be the end all and be all. And as far as the decision making goes, this is an information for you to use. It isn't the decision maker itself. Off my soapbox and back to the slide. So in evidence-based practice, you're going to convert information needs related to practice decisions into clear questions. Boy, I had a good example in my head when I wrote that sentence, or took that sentence from the text, and it's escaping me at the moment. But you have a general kind of idea of what it is that the client presents with these problems, and so you want to translate these into clear questions that have very specific kinds of things to research, because in order to do a good search, you're going to have a good question that can call up studies related to that question. Then, through your expert use of the different resources that are at your fingertips in the internet or in the library or wherever you might be, you're going to track down the best evidence with which to answer those specific questions. You will appraise the evidence critically for validity, that is the closeness to the truth, impact, that is the size of the effect. I mean, again, some studies are very limited in terms of what they specifically, well, the number of people that they've studied, and also the variability in the effect if you know if well, if whatever happened in the study happens again or doesn't happen again, and its applicability. How useful is it to you in practice? How much does it connect with the client that you're working with? I mean, is the population that was studied even remotely connected to the client or the client's life? So then you use your clinical expertise to integrate all this information with your client, and to find out whether it applies to this situation. And then as you carry out these steps, you evaluate the effectiveness and efficiency of this, of whatever it is you find, and look for ways to improve those things in the future. Social workers, Gambrill believes that we don't draw upon practice-related research findings enough to inform our decisions, that we really should be looking more at research, taking the time to going back and seeing, the research is always, and I think we'll be touching on this later on, that there's always new research out there. Sometimes that research contradicts earlier research. Remember early in the semester we talked about this, a sociological fact or whatever, a sociological tenet is that all truth in at least in sociology, all truth is tentative. Tentative. That means that until another study comes along and said this is no longer true, this is true. But that another study may come along and contradict this someday. And that's the way it is with human beings and with life. It's that's some of that uncertainty that Gambrill talks about, that we have to deal with all the time. And so it's important for us to keep up with research as much as possible, because if we don't do that, we're going to be out of date, and find ourselves using some techniques that have been discounted, and might be harmful to clients even. She also mentions, interestingly, that we're not as good at honoring informed consent obligations as we think we are. But that, I think, well, it's just something. I think she's talking about being very, very thorough in making sure that clients understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, how effective it's likely to be, how what are the risks and what are the benefits. A lot of times we don't talk about the risks with clients of intervention, for that matter, and making sure that the client understands all that before they consent to the process. Some references to the NASW code that she mentions in regards to informed consent and keeping current with emerging knowledge. And again, quoting from her text, she says that there are large gaps between what research suggests is effective and what services are, and what and clients. I'm sorry. Yeah, there are large gaps between what research suggests is effective and what services are, and clients are not informed typically that recommended services are of unknown effectiveness or have been found to be ineffective or even harmful when they're provided. So this is the things that she believes about how we do our practice. I hope that's not true for us, but she says it may be. Now, it's not only EBP is not only about using empirically based treatments, but also includes things like looking at the client's values and making sure that whatever you do fits with their values, that it pays attention to the individual circumstances of the client, that it considers the constraints of resources that we have to deal with. That there are, as she'll say over and over again, there are going to be times, maybe most of the time, maybe even almost all of the time, when you can't do the best possible thing for your client because of resources. This also includes sharing the information that is found, and that includes if you find nothing. If you do your research, can't find anything, You make sure the client knows that before they consent, and then this all has got a part to play in them being engaged as informed participants in the process. EBP wants us to move away from authority-based approaches that relies on professional consensus and tradition. And she mentions here somewhere that even our vaunted professional journals, that are research articles that are peer reviewed and everything, also should be held suspect. That even though, well, that's authority based practice, really. And while there are studies there and they give you all the things you need to know in order to make a good review of the study, she says also sometimes those studies are funded, in ways that sort of predict the results, or they're reviewed by people who are more favorable towards one person and not towards another, and those kinds of things. And when all those things come into play, again, hopefully minimally, but perhaps more than we know. And so just keep it in mind. I'm not saying don't rely on professional journals, but they're not Gambrill says at least, that they're not the end all and be all that many people would have us believe in any profession for that matter. To move away from authority-based approach and move towards one in which ethical obligations to clients are honored, and it involves an honest brokering of knowledge and of ignorance, excluding misrepresentation of disliked views, or ignoring counter evidence that contradict the ones we prefer. Again, this is somewhat repetitious. I guess promoting transparency and accountability about what is done and to what effect. And this does really give us a good approach for integrating ethics, evidence, and application, and to maximize the flow of knowledge. And I like the word, and this is not a term that she coined, but this is a term I don't hear very often, reducing puffery, which is, inflated claims of knowledge. I just like the image that term calls up. So a key contribution of evidence-based practice is discouraging inflated claims of knowledge that mislead involved parties and hinder the development of knowledge. When we rely upon, we don't question studies, or we don't question the kinds of knowledge that we want to rely upon. We really do hinder the development of new knowledge, and really kind of growing in our ability to understand the things that we're treating. She talks about well established and validated, and I'm going to touch on that in a minute. So we'll just leave that there for the moment. Some of the programs that she uses an example here, I thought this was useful in putting up on a slide. The well accepted tenets of practice that she questions. That scared straight programs to decrease delinquency, that brief psychological debriefing programs prevent post-traumatic stress disorder. This has been a very popular trend among, particularly for the critical incident stress debriefing teams that I've mentioned in previously, that work with individuals who are first responders in emergencies and those kinds of things, to kind of help reduce the secondary stress that they experience in responding. She says there aren't a lot of studies out there that indicate that they're as effective as the people who employ them want us to believe. That eyewitness testimony can be trusted. This is something I've heard many times, that eyewitnesses aren't always reliable at all. Genograms have been shown to be valuable in achieving client goals. They're a favorite tool in social work. I've used them in my classes, and I've had them used in classes that I've taken, and I've learned from that. But does that mean that they're valuable in achieving client goals? Remains to be seen. I have seen some benefits from them, but again, that's that thing where that the richness of our own experience and how that can cloud out all the beliefs we have about what statistics tell us, rather, or sometimes our own personal anecdotes can cause us to lose sight of what statistics say. And you see the other things here. Anger management programs for adolescents are effective. In fact, anger management programs in general, I question the effectiveness of them. But again, that's Another example of some of the things where, what happens is we don't have a lot of resources around us, and so we have to use the things that are at our fingertips, so to speak, sometimes, and so in sending clients to programs that may be less effective, that maybe the research doesn't support, we still convince ourselves that there's benefits from them because, well, that's all we have. There are obstacles that we encounter in the use of evidence-based practice, including the fact that integrating evidentiary issues might clash with practices in agencies. In other words, well, for one thing, because you don't get time, you don't get research time in agencies. At least if you do, consider yourself lucky. And you don't have a researcher that's been hired to do the research for you either. And so, you know, if you're sitting and reading instead of seeing clients working, keeping up your contact standards for your caseload, or seeing a paying client if you're working for an outpatient agency where it's a fee for service kind of thing, you're going to have some issues with your administration probably. Sometimes staff are punished for challenging authority-based practice, for asking questions about the effectiveness of the things that the agencies do. You hopefully will have administration that is open to the input you have, but oftentimes you do not. Our resources may be lacking, and that includes our own time, how much time we have, but also, the kind of things that we need at our fingertips in order to do the kind of research that we would need to do. We may lack statistical literacy, and it's a very common obstacle, and I've heard. I had my research courses and took my statistics classes, you know, in my education, and happily it's been years since then, and so the pain and agony associated with those classes have kind of faded into my into my have receded into the back of my mind, is what I'm trying to say. But I've talked to current MSW students over the years who much gnawing and gnashing of teeth about the research class, but it's something that's going to be very useful to you and something that's real important in your education. And here she talks about well-established claims, and that's one of the justifications a lot of times for making use of the techniques or the approaches that we use are well-established claims. And key here is claim, by the way. It's a big word. But even the American Psychological Association says that two well-designed, randomized, controlled trials showing a positive outcome qualify as well-established, when it would be, she thinks, more transparent to say it was critically tested in two well-designed randomized control panels and passed both tests. In other words, we don't have to call them well established. We should just say there were two studies and they passed both of these tests. Because when you say it's well established, that really kind of takes the uncertainty out of it. And she says we should keep uncertainty in view. Again, go back to that simple sociological tenet about tentative truth. Nothing is certain, and the well established claim part kind of takes away the uncertainty. So, how we phrase our questions is something that's very important when we're going to go about doing research. So, if you know anything about Google, Google, and Google's just one example, but any place you go to, any search engine you go into, the words you use really determine the results you get. And sometimes you have to play around with how you phrase your question so that you get the most meaningful results. I'm sure you've all run into that. And there are guidelines for this in this textbook, and I am not going into them here, and really not digging into them in our course, because again, I think that's something that is for your research class, and is something that you're going to get better instruction on from the research expert than from me. But the EBP process suggests four parts for a well-structured question, which is first the client type or client population, What is the intervention that you're interested in doing? What alternative course of actions are there, including nothing at all? And what are the hoped for outcomes of the question? So there's an appendix in at the end of chapter 10 in this textbook that gives you a form basically that you could use for posing questions and searching for answers. And it has these particular parts to it. What's the decision that you want to make? What well-structured question do you have related to the decision? How did you structure your question? What kind of question type is it? Is it about effectiveness, or is it about risk? Is it about an assessment, that kind of thing? What is the best answer that you had before searching for the evidence? What resources have you used in your search? And what's the best answer based on a review of external research after you've done your research? So this is a good thing if you're going to keep a record of, which I know this is recommended in EBP, that you keep track of your research. It helps you, first of all, it's a shortcut later on because you've got past research processes documented, and it's also a good thing, I think, for your record. And again, I don't want to overemphasize the thing about malpractice or anything, but just in terms of demonstrating that you're responsibly researching for your clients, that it can help you later on keep these things on hand somewhere. And this is a good little form you could use for that purpose. There are sources that contain high quality reviews of research, and using them really is going to give you the most productive searches. And she talks about the Cochrane collaboration and the Campbell collaboration as two examples of this. They're both available on the internet, and the Cochrane, she says it's available on a subscription basis, and I haven't really looked at the Cochrane collaboration, but let me see if this works. I called up the Campbell website, so hopefully you're seeing what I'm seeing, which is a dynamic the Campbell collaboration homepage, and it deals with Campbell seems to. Cochrane's more focused on health, which is related to us, of course, but Campbell also deals with more specific kinds of things related to social services, I believe. But also, you'll see if you just scroll down the page, about some of the the latest reviews and the latest evidence. Here's something on mindfulness training, for instance, treatment of sex offenders, interesting kinds of things, and there's you can click on this to get the review, and you can also get a plain language. Here's the plain language summary, and then if you go to the Campbell Library up here on the top, it's an example of this. This is and again, some of the areas there's different coordinating groups for systematic reviews. Let's say social welfare, for instance. See all reviews. Are there more? Let's look here to see what comes up. Well, I think, those are all the reviews in the coordinating groups. Yeah, wait, I'm sorry to be flicking around on here. If you click on social welfare, okay, let me go back a minute here, if I may. Click on social welfare. All right. Now, here's an article on the deployment of personnel to military operations, impact on mental health and social functioning, the effectiveness of interventions to reduce homelessness. That was mentioned earlier. And see, here's a link where you can download all the files on the reviews. Let's click on this just for a second. And just to kind of show a little bit about, this tells you a little bit about the systematic review. There are large numbers of homeless people around the world. Interventions to address homelessness seem to be effective, though better quality evidence is required. And what are the main results? And this tells you what the results are. We're not going to go into this in great detail here, but it tells you a little bit about the search methods and the selection criteria. And there are panels of people who do these researches, or this research in these topics, and then prepare summaries for you of the studies. And then there's a place where you can download all the files, I believe, connected to the review. So anyway, this is the Campbell collaboration, and spend some time digging around here. There's a place where you can keep your search history and all those kinds of things. You'll find sometimes some good articles there if you aren't familiar with it at all. So, but you know, we Google a lot, and when you do these search engines, Google or whatever it might be, they're really they're a good source for practice and policy research. But you have to be careful, as because the material out there differs greatly as far as accuracy goes, and some people can put together some great web pages, and the Google results, I believe, have to do with popularity of searches and things like that, not necessarily accuracy. Unlike the Campbell collaboration or the Cochrane collaboration, you don't have any so-called experts or knowledgeable people that are kind of reviewing these things and kind of curating them for you, which is kind of what's going on with these collaborations. Which again, by the way, Campbell and Cochrane collaboration is still another source of expert opinion, in the end, but maybe better refined at least. But in any event, you don't have that with Google, and so you have to be really cautious and be a wise consumer of information you get off of there. And some of the questions you can ask yourself is like, what is the source of funding? Because that has a lot to do. In my introductory courses, I have one of my classes, I have them do a kind of a social issues debate, yes and no, about some particular question of the day, and when it comes to questions like abortion or family planning or same-sex adoption, that kind of thing, inevitably, the conservative side winds up using resources such as, the Family Research Council and the Heritage Foundation, and these are very well known, very conservative organizations. And I'm always trying to tell my students, be careful about that, because you're going to get results, and it's not to say the results aren't valid, but if you look those organizations up, and find out what their mission is, it's a very conservative, narrowly defined mission. It's usually to support traditional values, and that tells you that they're probably not going to publish materials that contradict what they want to support. So that tells you that there's a bias in the research that they publish, and or at least in what they publish. And so anyway, that's just one example of that. I think you have to be real careful about that. Do they present well argued alternatives? Do they even talk about the alternatives and treat them with some respect? Because sometimes there are disagreements, and a good research study is going to tell you what those disagreements are and look at both sides of it, basically. So anyway, just some caveats about research on the internet. So any research report, the questions you're going to ask, was there a clear research question posed to begin with? Was the study design appropriate? Did it match the question? Was there a decent sample size? And was the source of the sample something that applies to your client? Was it representative of the population of interest? Were the measures used valid and reliable? Were the claims made from the research accurate? Do they really, are they reflected in the results of the study? The claims in the summary. Was the data analyzed appropriately? Was it a high quality systematic review or a haphazard narrative one? And again, these are the kinds of things that you're going to learn more about in your research course that will give you an opportunity to really be an effective consumer of these studies. Finally, when all is said and done, you want to share the uncertainties about your approach with your client. Talk about the strengths and the weaknesses. Talk about the things you do know based upon research, even though you don't really know anything, and what you don't know. And these are things that your client has a right to know. And even the best decision you have is going to be made in the context of uncertainty. You're not going to be 100% sure of what you're doing, probably ever. And if the best kind of research isn't available, then that's that well-designed randomized controlled trial that Gambrill thinks is the best kind of study out there. Then you kind of move down the hierarchy of what comes next. What's the next best type of research, and on and on and on and on. And if there isn't any research available, then you're going to wind up drawing on practice theory to guide your work. And just keep in mind also as you're looking at these studies, and I'll just say this finally, that bias enters, and this is where I started out, bias enters on all levels. I think, researchers have a bias oftentimes as they plan and conduct their study and prepare their reviews. I think it was my diversity class that I taught years ago. I don't know what class it was, but there was it was pointed out that for all of the studies that have been done in psychology, let's say, or in the field of human services about women, that most of the people who have conducted those studies, who designed the studies, who posed the question, who conducted the research, and who wrote up and published the studies, and who reviewed the studies, most of the people who did all that were men, not women. Now, that's changing, of course, as time goes on. Women are more and more and more moving into that area, but much of the research, and not only about women, but I use that just because of the contrast there, that kind of is a telling point, that much of the research that has been done on almost any topic that we have read in any of our fields is done by men. And so what that tells you is that this is all filtered through the filter of patriarchy. And so just the thing to keep in mind, researchers have bias, reviewers have bias, and practitioners have bias. We all make decisions through the filters of what we find acceptable, what we think we know, and what we believe and what we value. All right, that'll do it. And I hope, again, that there's something useful in this for you, and that you can walk away saying you know a little more about Gambill because you listened to me. Please let me know if questions come up, and otherwise we'll talk again soon. Bye for now.